Welcome back. Today we are going to look at two types of speciation. And they are what we call sympatric, not sympathetic, sympatric speciation, and allopatric. Speciation. Okay, so let's talk about number one first of all. We'll go with sympatric first. These are quite simple. Sympatric speciation. Remember, speciation is the diverging of gene pools in a population to the point where they become a separate species. And we've looked at all the different ways that could happen. Basically, this is what happens when you have speciation that occurs within populations that are in the same geographical areas. Okay, so what we have is let's sort of make a kind of a sentence here. Sympatric speciation occurs when populations in the same geographic area diverge and become reproductively isolated. Now, reproductively isolated means that for some reason the individuals are unable to mate or reproduce with each other. And as we've seen in previous videos, there's many reasons why that could happen. It could be that it's a time difference, or it could be some sort of habitat difference, and all kinds of reasons why. It might even be something to do with a gametic type of issue where they can't produce viable offspring, all kinds of things and reasons. So when we say reproductively isolated, we have to remember, we always think of the word isolated that meaning that you're all alone. It doesn't mean that. It just means that you're unable to reproduce with each other for various reasons, as we've seen. Okay, so we're talking about a geographical location, and you have a particular species or in this location, and for some reason the species begins to diverge genetically. This is more common with plants, I would think, this kind of speciation. I'm going to give you some examples to show you what I mean. The factors that affect this are usually chromosomal changes. So chromosomal changes, especially in plants, and I'll explain that in a second. So I'll put plants here. And for animals, it's typically non-random mating. So factors that sort of affect who the females are choosing. That's more of the mechanism for animals. So let me talk about what I mean by chromosomal changes in plants very briefly. So you'll recall that typically we have what's called an autosomal cell. That's a big fancy word that means a body cell, right? And it typically has 2n, or the diploid number of chromosomes. And for humans, we know that that's 46. And then we have what's called a gamete, which is essentially a sperm or an egg. And the sperm or the egg typically has the N number, or the haploid number. Okay, you'll also recall that the autosomal cells are reproducing by the process of mitosis, whereas gametes are formed in the process of meiosis, so we know that. Now remember that errors can happen during mitosis and meiosis. There are a number of times in both processes where chromosomes are lining up in the center of the cell and then are being pulled apart and separated. And if they don't pull apart properly or they don't separate properly, you can get some very odd situations. So in particular, if we look at the gametes that can be formed, when you have let's say you have a cell where the 2n number is for, let's go 6 chromosomes. What you would have then is sort of 3 homologous pairs of chromosomes. Okay, so each of these is a homologous sort of set. And what's supposed to happen is they're supposed to separate in meiosis. Remember, the homologous pairs pull apart. But what if they don't? If they don't separate, then what you'll get is you'll get one gamete that has all 6, and the other one will get nothing and will die. And you'll get this weird situation. What we call this is we call it, instead of a haploid or diploid, we call it a polyploid. So polyploid, or the condition of polyploidy, means that you have more chromosomes than usual, more than the diploid number. Okay? And polyploids can occur quite often in plants. In animals, they tend to result in situations that don't produce viable offspring and they die off quite quickly. I guess that's because animals are much more complex in terms of their biology and their biochemistry, and they can't tolerate as many mistakes in their meiosis process. But plants can get away with it. So I'll give you an example of a plant, the wheat plant, for instance. Wheat is a plant that originally had 7 chromosomes. Wild wheat. But what happened? So that would be the 2n number, right? The diploid number. Actually, seven sets, I guess. Or let me think that through. Seven sets. Give me 1 second. I will return in a minute. Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I just wanted to double check on this before I set you astray. It's actually 2 sets of 7. That's what I meant. So 2 sets of 7, which is a total of 14 chromosomes, right? So basically there are 7 chromosomes in each, with a homologue of themselves. There's 7 and 7, so 14 in total. So the diploid number for wheat was 14, and the haploid number was 7. So under normal situations for wheat, the gametes that are formed should have the 14 chromosomes separated with 7 in each. But in some cases, mistakes would happen, and it would be 14 and 0. Or perhaps it could be any number. It doesn't have to be all of them. Sometimes some will fail to separate and others won't. So you can get all different combinations. So this is a mistake in the meiosis process. But what happens with wheat, I mean, really, with only 14 chromosomes, with all of its instructions, wheat is a fairly simplistic organism. So it can tolerate having the 14 chromosomes. So this gamete, which would normally end up dying if this was an animal, would actually survive. And then it could mate with others. But it would have to mate with others that also had 14. So it would mate with others, I'm going to use the word with other mistakes, right? And then what would happen is you'd have normal wheat with its 2n and n being 14 and 7. And now you have this sort of mistake that was made where the 2n number is now 28 and the n number is now 7. because these guys are mating. These are the mistakes that are mating, and they're viable. They actually survive. And so what's happened with wheat over the years is the wild wheat has been carefully bred by humans, right, to produce things. And what we have are two types of wheat. One type of wheat has 6 sets of 7 chromosomes. So it's what we call a hexaploidy. It's hexaploid instead of diploid. It's got 6 sets. In other words, there are not just homologous pairs, but the homologs are in sets of 6, which is quite impressive. And then there's another one that has 4 sets of 7. These are the two major domestic wheat variations. And so this is a condition of polyploidy. And what it produces is 2 different species. The species here on the left that I just circled is not the same as the species over here on the right, because the number of chromosomes is vastly different, and they can no longer mate with each other, right? There's not enough matchup when the gametes are formed to fertilize. And so they become 2 completely different species of wheat. So plants often have this happen, this idea of polyploidy, which is an example of sympatric speciation. It's happening within the same species in the same geographical area, but it's because of chromosomal changes, or I guess we could say errors or mistakes in the meiosis process that produces gametes with various odd sets of chromosomes. And so this would be the kind of example that we're talking about. All right. And again, this usually happens in plants. Usually happens in plants. The other thing that can happen in plants, if you'll recall, is that 2 odd gametes might produce a gamete that itself is infertile. In other words, it can't sexually reproduce, but this thing could also reproduce by asexual reproduction. Remember that plants and a few animals, whoops, I meant to write reproduction there, can do this. So sometimes you'll see a sympatric speciation where there'll be an odd meiotic mistake that causes a mutation or a change in the gamete. And the gamete is not going to be able to reproduce sexually anymore, but asexual reproduction is possible. And the species can continue by reproducing asexually. So that's another option, or another way that this can happen. Okay. And as I said, typically we see it more with plants because animals cannot seem to tolerate the degree of meiotic mistakes. Second type is allopatric speciation, and this is more the kind of example that we are familiar with because we've been talking about various examples of this. Essentially, what happens here is a population is split in 2, or split in could be in 3 or 4 or whatever, but it's split into groups, into isolated groups. And I mean reproductively isolated, right? Isolated groups. By some kind of geographical barrier. So it's a physical change in the environment. The good example was, you'll recall I told you about the East African Rift Valley, where this region, where human ancestors were living, was separated into 2 regions by a massive earthquake and shifting of tectonic plates that opened up a large rift. And what essentially happened is it changed this into 2 completely different and distinct environments. One environment on one side, because the climatic changes here, was a still rainforest, and basically where the chimps continued on. And of course, this other place was more of a dry savanna, which means that different conditions produce very different evolutionary pressures, which eventually produced the earliest humans Okay, so this would be some kind of major geographical event that prohibits the mating of the two species. These species could not get together and mate anymore, so the gene flow was stopped between the two populations, and there was no more flow of genes because of this geographical event or something that's happened. This could be anything. It could be a glacier. It could be a lava flow. It could be ocean level fluctuations. It could be, a peninsula becomes an island. Like you can imagine if there's a long peninsula of land on a, and the ocean level rises and cuts it off so that this now is all water. Now the island is separate. And so this could happen, right? Yeah, very good. Okay, so I think that's basically enough to explain that. One example of allopatric speciation is what we call adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation, to radiate means to sort of go out from, right? Radiation. So adaptive radiation is a sort of a type of allopatric speciation where we get a very rapid diversification of the gene pool, diversification of species. And it's usually because there are adapting to a variety of new environments. And so the classic example of this, remember, is Darwin's finches. So the finches on the Galapagos Islands. Finches. Remember, on the Galapagos Island, off the southern coasts of South America, there's a bunch of islands here. And these islands are a fair distance out. And so on these islands, they are volcanic islands, and when they formed, slowly life sort of creeps towards the islands. And so there were a variety of insects which could easily make the trip across by flying, right? Flying insects. What's interesting, though, is there were no land birds of any kind yet. And some finches that lived on the mainland, or finches that were migrating from between North and South America, it's thought that these finches on their migration would have gotten blown off course by storms, and some of them would have landed on the Galapagos Islands. And remember, where the finches were from, wherever they came from, either here or wherever they migrated from, they had adapted to a very specific environment, because all the other environments or niches or habitats were occupied by other birds. So they didn't have any advantage. Their advantage was to stick to eating seeds and to taking on a very specific form that was less diverse. But once they land on the Galapagos Island, where there are no other birds, no land birds anyway, then they have free run of the island, which means all this one species of finch can radiate outwards into all the different habitats. Nobody's competing with them anymore. And so they can eat insects and they can eat different things. They can expand their opportunities. And as they do, because they're moving into different habitats, they become isolated, right? Remember, we talked about how you can be reproductively isolated if you're in a different habitat. And so what you end up with are species A, B, C, D, and E of new finches, all with different shapes and sizes because they've adapted to this new environment. So this is what we call adaptive radiation. Essentially, new opportunities present themselves in a variety of ways, and it usually happens when there is some sort of geographical event. In this case, it would be, the geographical separation of the islands, the formation of a new volcanic island in the ocean. With humans in Africa again, this rift that opens up is a geographical barrier, and it creates an entirely new environment on this side. And this environment now begins to favor all different types of things. And so we see, I wouldn't say this was so much an adaptive radiation example, but it's sort of the idea. Well, I guess it could be, because if you think about it, the original ancestors in this area would have been a particular single species or a few species of Australopithecines, but very quickly they evolved into a number of different hominids, another different human-like species. So that could also be considered an adaptive radiation of sorts. Essentially, a new environment opens up, and there are a whole bunch of new habitats and niches that are available, and we see a very rapid formation of new species, allopatric. All right, and the last thing I'll put in this video is something called divergent evolution. And this is simply a definition where species diverge and become increasingly distinct. They get different from each other, increasingly different, let's put. Right? So a single species might begin to evolve because of all these things we've talked about into two species. And so as they evolve, they are becoming more and more different. And each generation, they get more and more and more different, diverging. But in a convergent kind of evolution, we see two different species that are evolving in their own way. Right? They're not really mating or doing anything with each other, but as they evolve, they tend to become similar. They get closer together. They have similar traits. So, for instance, if you think about birds, as they evolved to fly, right? They evolved wings, and their habitat is based on being in the air and high places and trees. And then you think about bats. Bats and birds are not very closely related at all, even though they both fly, but they do look and share similar habitats and have some similar features. Bats also fly and have wings. So this is kind of like two species that are sort of becoming more like each other randomly through their evolution. They are quite different, though. The bird wing, if you look inside the wing of a bird, you will see that it has bones very much like you. It has the humerus, the upper arm bone, and it has the radius and the ulna, which I believe are fused together. Well, not necessarily. Some birds are fused, some aren't. It has the same bones as you, and it has a little wrist, and it even has little finger bones at the tip of the wing. But the bat wing evolved completely differently. It evolved from the hand. So when you look at the wing of a bat, it's basically long finger bones. It's the finger bones, and inside the finger bones, or sort of around the finger bones, is the webbing of the wing. So when a bat flies, its wings are basically its hands, whereas in the bird, the wing is the entire arm. And so they are not the same, but they have both seemingly converged towards a similar sort of body plan and outline and so on. So that's convergent evolution. All right. And then lastly, to wrap things up, since we're almost done here, we can talk about the speed of evolution. How fast does evolution happen? And this is basically unknown at this point. I mean, we have theories, we have ideas. We think that it happens fairly slowly, but there were different ideas. The first idea was gradualism, which basically meant gradualism. I put an extra wiggle on there. Gradualism simply means that evolution is taking place at a very slow and steady gradualism rate, a slow and steady rate where one species is slowly turning into the other over millions of years. Recently, though, around 1970s, early 1970s, there was I guess you could call him an evolutionary anthropologist. Stephen Gould was his name. And he put forward this theory of what's called punctuated equilibrium. Equilibrium. So equilibrium kind of means steady state, but punctuated means this. Instead of gradualism, where a species slowly evolves from one to another like this, they found evidence to suggest that evolution can actually not move very much at all. A species will stay the same, and then suddenly there'll be some drastic effect that changes the species, and then it stays the same, and then another drastic effect. These drastic effects that I'm drawing here might last a few thousand years or a few 100,000 years. Remember, in the geological time scale, 1,000 years is like a blink of an eye. So when we say sudden events in geology and in anthropology and in the study of life, paleontology and all of that, we're talking about still very long periods of time compared to human lifetimes. But the idea was that there was these periods of relative equilibrium or stability where species didn't change much, and then there had to be some kind of sort of an event. These massive changes were triggered by events. And when you think about everything we've learned, that kind of makes sense. You can imagine how, a geographical incident has to happen in order for something to happen. The species of primates in Africa was very, very much constant until that Great Rift Valley opened up and created new environments and habitats for adaptive radiation and so on. The Galapagos Islands was a brand new thing, the volcanic islands that sprung up out of the oceans as the volcanoes erupted from the ocean floor, producing a brand new environment, which would then give the opportunity for a sudden change in species. So the speed of evolution is debated. It's either a punctuated equilibrium, which I think is the favored sort of view now, and the idea of gradualism is slowly fading out of popularity. All right, and that's really the end of the chapter. That's all there is for us to worry about in this, which ends our unit. So we'll call that a day. And that's it for our introductory study